Yeah, we really have had brilliant sermons recently, and it's actually a real problem for me because it means that the bar is set really high, and yeah, I'm going to struggle to meet that. Anyway, where are you going to be in 3 years' time? What will your life look like in 3 years' time? Obviously, we'll all be older, but will you be fitter and healthier? Will you be happier? What will your relationships look like with family members and friends? And most importantly, what about your relationship with God? Because the thing is that where we'll be in 3 years' time has an awful lot to do with the choices we make today. God is the God of change. He is always at work. He is always changing us. And Ephesians 3 verse 20 says that God is able, through his mighty power at work within us, to accomplish infinitely more than we might ask or think. So if we have a relationship with God, then God is always working in us and through us to make us more like Jesus. However, while God is all-powerful, we can choose to either align ourselves with what God is doing, or actually some of the choices we make can limit what God does in our lives. So, what are these choices? Well, if you're anything like me, if you're facing a big choice such as moving job, deciding whether or not to apply for a new job or whether or not to move house, I will obsess about this and bore everyone around me and talk again and again and again about them. But actually, while those decisions can be important, the thing that really impacts our lives is the small choices. The small daily choices we make again and again add up to make a huge difference. So, what do we call these choices? We call them habits. Now, we all know what a habit is, but I thought it would be useful to put up a definition. So, a habit is a repeated decision we make on a regular basis. A decision we make repeatedly, again and again, on a regular basis. Now, this morning I'd like to look at a couple of people from the Bible who had regular habits which influenced who they became. And the first person we're going to look at is Daniel. Now, just to give a bit of background on Daniel, Daniel was an Israelite who lived in Babylon. The Babylonians attacked Jerusalem, ransacking the city, and then taking a whole pile of captives back to their own land. And Daniel was one of the captives. Now, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, he wanted to train up some of the young captives as advisors to the king. So we'll have a look at that. If you have a Bible with you this morning, please could you turn to Daniel chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. So it'll come up on the screen. This is the king. This is Nebuchadnezzar speaking. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men. That sounds like me. Make sure they're well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. I think what the king did here was genius, because he chose the best people from among the captives, and then he would train them for 3 years. And by training them in the language and the literature of the land, and he also gave them a new Babylonian name, the hope was that they would forget their old ways and their old customs and their old religion and just start to live the same lives as the Babylonians around them. But Daniel was different. He really pushed against this. He and 3 other captives refused to eat the food and drink from the king's store. They chose instead to eat nothing but vegetables and water in line with what God had commanded. Daniel made this repeated choice day after day after day. He chose self-discipline. He chose to honor God instead of allowing himself to be taken in by the temptations of the Babylonians. Now, this was a daily choice, and it became a habit. Daniel created a habit of self-discipline for the entire 3-year training period. Now, I know it can't have been easy, but we can see how his life turns out after the training period is over. Daniel chapter 1, verses 18 to 20. It says, "When the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Ananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service, and whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom." So Daniel made a small choice. He just made the small choice of rejecting the food and the drink from the king's store and just to eat the vegetables and water. But actually, because of that faithfulness to God, day after day after day, he then had Daniel and his friends were honored hugely when they obeyed the Lord. Now, we don't really have time to go into it this morning, you'll be glad to know, but it says later in the book of Daniel that Daniel had also established the habit of prayer. He prayed 3 times a day, which I believe kept him grounded when persecution came. Daniel had built in good habits, which gave him a firm foundation so he could respond with confidence in times of trouble. In Daniel chapter 6, verse 10, a law had just been signed by King Darius, who succeeded Nebuchadnezzar, saying that for the next month, no one was allowed to pray to anybody except the king. If you broke the law, you'd be put to death. And this is a story of how Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. But it says that when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room, with his windows open towards Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day. You see, there are 3 things about habits that I want to emphasize this morning. But before I do, I'd like to highlight Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. And I think it's one of my favorite verses. It is, I think, so important. Galatians 6, verse 7. "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." And the Passion Translation puts it like this: "God will never be mocked, for what you plant will always be the very thing that you harvest." So we reap what we sow. Daniel sowed righteousness, he sowed self-discipline, he nurtured his relationship with God, and what he reaped was honor and position in the king's court. So the first thing I believe about habits is this: we reap what we sow. In Daniel's life, he sows discipline and godly habits, and he reaps an abundance of blessings. God blessed Daniel even through persecution. He was thrown in the lion's den, possibly expecting to be killed. And so sometimes the ripening of what we sow is not exactly what we think it'll be. Daniel was persecuted for a time, but then God in his sovereignty brought breakthrough. Let's look at another example. If we think of King David, when he was a shepherd long before he was a king, he lived on the hills looking after his sheep. Now, this wasn't a glamorous job, but David was studious. He was faithful to God in his job, and he ended up killing Goliath. David proved that he was faithful in the small things. What caused him to be faithful? Well, David's faithfulness and our own faithfulness comes from our love for God. And we can see that in Luke 16, verse 10. If you're faithful in little things, you'll be faithful in large ones. But if you're dishonest in little things, you won't be honest with greater responsibilities. And we can see that pattern in David's life. When David was getting ready to fight Goliath, King Saul tried to talk him out of it. What was David's response? Well, he said that as a shepherd, he had learned to fight off lions and bears, and that Goliath was no different. David was faithful in the little things, and so he was then faithful in large ones. You know, I grew up in a church, and my dad was a minister, and so I grew up with the story of David and Goliath. But there was something I'd never actually considered until I started preparing for this morning. When David went out to fight Goliath, he picked up 5 stones from a stream and got them ready with his sling to fight him. But how did David know that he had any chance of hitting the giant? How did he know he was going to be accurate? I know if I got a sling and some stones, I'd probably do more damage to myself than anyone else. But David had confidence, and yes, the Lord gave him confidence, but he knew he could be accurate because he had practiced it before. He had spent years on the hills, using his sling and stones to fight off lions and bears, and he had built up this ability to fight a giant in battle through being faithful in the small things. So, not only do we reap what we sow, we also reap more than we sow. David was faithful in the small things, in his lowly job of looking after the sheep on the hills, but he reaped so much more than he sowed because he became king of Israel. So we reap what we sow, we reap more than we sow, and also we reap after we sow. Sometimes the fruit from habits can take some time to mature. Like David, we can make good choices now and maybe think, well, they're not really making much of a difference. We might think, for example, I want to get fit, so I'll take up walking. I'll go out for an hour-long walk every day. You go out for a walk for a day, you don't feel any fitter. You go out for 3 days, still no difference. You might go out for even a fortnight and you still think, I don't actually feel much difference. But actually the change is happening on the inside. Little by little, gradually, all of these small choices compound, and so after some time, suddenly you feel so much fitter because you've made that choice and done it repeatedly, time after time. I'm going to give out some free money. Whoa, everyone's woken up. Jerry, you're actually sleeping. It suddenly has jumped up. Literally, I saw him do this. No, that was a joke. I'm actually, if you know me, I'm far too tight to actually give anything away for free. But I am going to use it as an example. So let's just suspend reality, pretend I'm actually a generous person, and I am going to give out some money. And so you have 2 choices. You can either have £1 million today, or you can have 1 penny today, but the penny will double each day for a month. Which would you choose? Now, obviously we would think, well, the obvious answer is the million, so I should probably go for the penny, because I think logically it'll probably work out better. If you were going to choose the penny, then you would have got more money. So let's have a look at this. So day 1, if you have a penny. Day 2, obviously 2p. Day 3, 4p. I'm just showing off that I can double in my head. Keep going. On day 5, 16p. On day 10, you have 20 quid. Day 20, you're doing a bit better, you have 20,000 quid. On day 28, you have more than £1 million. And on the final day of the month, you have £10,737,418 and 24p. Is that the heave offering? Yeah, please. Now, that was a bit of a silly example, but the point I'm making is this. Small choices that we make, added up over time, can make a huge difference. And if we know the story of King David well, then we'll also know that he stops making good choices. 2 Samuel 11, verse 1, it says, "In the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. Now, in those days, it was the annual tradition that kings would usually go to war in the springtime, and that would happen year after year. And David, I believe, did this at the start, when he was a king, but once he had built up some success, he then started to get lazy. And he started just to select other people, other military commanders, to go out and do the fighting for him. David didn't fulfill his responsibilities. He didn't fulfill his duties. And it tells us twice in that verse that David did not go out to fight as he usually would have done. What happens next? Well, the very next verse starts to tell us about David sleeping with Bathsheba, and then that leads to murder. And there are loads of different factors in that, loads of different reasons, but the one I want to focus on is the first choice that David made. He chose not to fulfill his duties as king. He got lazy. David made just a few small choices at the beginning, but it led to huge consequences in the end. Now, I thank God that in his grace and his mercy, he still used David. Jesus came through the line of David, and it proves to us, I think, that even in David's mess and even in my mess and all of our messes, that God's grace is still sufficient. But David reaped what he sowed. He was lazy, that led to murder, and then towards the end of his life, there was close to a civil war between David's children. So we reap what we sow, we reap more than we sow, and we reap after we sow. You know, the devil's cunning. If you've ever found yourself doing something that you really wish you hadn't done, you might have done something or said something you just can't believe you did. Maybe you damaged a relationship with a family member. Maybe you acted in a really dishonest way. If any of us have done that, I know it's all of us this morning can think of things that we regret. But have a look at where we started. I guarantee that none of us will have woken up one day and decided to make this huge mistake. It'll have started with just one small choice. One little thing that we convince ourselves thinking it's not that big a deal, and then we then do something similar the following day, and it adds up and it adds up and snowballs. Psalm 139:23 says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts." You know, Ernest Hemingway says that change is gradual, then sudden. It's not how things happen. Change is gradual and then sudden. Let's say we have a relationship with a family member and it starts to break down. Maybe we start to argue a bit more, and just gradually, we don't notice that much of a difference, but then suddenly the relationship completely disintegrates and they stop talking to us, and maybe they don't want to see us anymore or whatever. Change is gradual and then sudden. Where do you want to be in 3 years' time? Hopefully not still sat here listening to me. But how do we develop a habit? Well, I believe that for a habit to work in the long term, there are 3 things we need. We need to make it easy, we need to make it obvious, and we need to make it regular. So, make it easy. We need to create a habit that is easy to do. You know, a devotional time, if that's not something that you do at the moment, just starting with 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes in the morning or in the evening, and just making it easy. All of us have 5 minutes free, I'm sure, at some point. But if we start it and we make it a daily habit and we build it up, it'll get bigger and bigger, and then we can increase time and maybe change how it looks, but just starting with 5 minutes. It's the same if we take walking as an example. If you're somebody who doesn't go for walks at the moment, then deciding to get up at 5 a.m. and to go for an hour-long walk, I wouldn't manage that. But 10 minutes a day, if we just do 10 minutes a day and we do it day after day after day, it'll hopefully not be that difficult, but it'll add up and become a habit. So make it easy. Make it obvious. So a lot of the time, I'm actually really bad at sticking to habits, and it's largely because I forget to do them. So what I do is I set a reminder on my phone, so my phone will go off and remind me to do the thing I've forgotten to do. So just making it really obvious, writing notes or maybe sticky notes and leaving them around the house, but just doing something to make it really obvious to remind us to do the thing that we want to do. So make it easy, make it obvious, and then finally make it regular. Choices only become habits when we are doing them frequently. If we look at the examples of Daniel and we look at David, the habits they formed were done on a daily basis, again and again and again. Now, not all habits necessarily need to be daily. If maybe there's a family member that you think they don't really talk to me anymore, then maybe just give them a phone on a Sunday afternoon, or just checking in with them a couple of times a week, giving them a message. But the important thing is the frequency of it, is making it a regular pattern that adds up and compounds over time. You know, our character, our lives, they will reflect the things that we value most. My brother-in-law, Graham, who lives in England, he gave me some excellent advice on my wedding day. He told me that no one just wakes up one morning and just spontaneously decides to get divorced. That's not really how it works. The thing that does happen is that there are small things, small choices you make day after day after day, and they add up until suddenly the marriage is broken down. So let's take an example. Let's say that I start to be critical to my wife, May. It never happened, has it? No, I wouldn't dare. But don't talk to her about what kind of husband I am, because not a good idea. But let's say I start to be critical, and I'm critical for a whole day. That's not a good idea, but that's not going to end in divorce. Not a smart thing to do, but doing it for one day is not going to end in divorce or going to end in a loveless marriage. That's what I think. I'm not going to test it out. But as I said, a day's not going to make that much of a difference? Maybe. I'm just going to move on. Let's move on. But if I do it for a month, or I do it for a year, or I do it for 10 years, just a small choice, just one small thing, but I do it again and again and again and again. If I do that for years, either will be divorced or it'll be a relationship breakdown. What was that? Can we stop heckling, please? Can we move on? Is that okay? No, I will not be here. No. I need someone safe who I can check in with each stage, just say that we're still alive. Yeah, safe word. But the point is this: one small choice, done once or twice, won't make that much of a difference, but the small choice, again and again and again, then that's really how things happen. The small choices we make, they add up. They make a huge difference. Now, I want to be really, really clear this morning. If you are living with a chronic illness, or you've had a relationship breakdown in your life, or anything else like that, I am not saying that it's your fault. I'm not saying it's your fault. But what I am saying is that God always gives us the power to make good choices. God has given us huge choice in how our lives will turn out. 1 Timothy 4 verse 8, it says, physical training is good, but training for godliness is much better, promising benefits in this life and in the life to come. There are so many good habits that we can have, but having a daily devotional time is absolutely foundational. It's the cornerstone habit that all these other habits are built upon. I want to emphasize this morning that we do all these things, all these good habits, in the Lord's strength. We rely on his strength for doing the positive, and then we lean on his grace when we fall. It all starts and ends with him, and that is why time with Jesus is so important. You know, the verse I shared at the start, Ephesians 3 verse 20, it tells us that God is able, through his mighty power at work within us, to accomplish infinitely more than we might ask or think. God is able, not we are able. It's in God's power that we do all these things. We rely on his strength. You know, this stuff, habits, they've changed my life. They really have. They've made me fitter. They've made me healthier. They've improved my marriage. They improved my relationship with my kids. They've improved my relationship with the Lord. They've even made me happier. You know, a couple of months ago, I started the habit of being thankful. Literally, wake up in the morning and my first thought is, thank you, Jesus, for, and I put something in, for my marriage, for my family, for a roof over my head, even for running water. We take so many things for granted. I take so many things for granted. But once I started that, and I did it day after day after day, it took me 10 seconds in the morning, but it actually changed my perspective. And so I got to a point where one morning, I went down into the kitchen and I turned on the tap and had a glass of water. I said, thank you so much, Lord, for running water. And there are 2.2 billion people who don't have that. And I take it for granted. So actually, that 10-second habit, done day after day after day, has made me happier. It's amazing. Monumental change, huge change, massive change starts with one thing. One small choice done repeatedly, day after day after day. Life-changing, absolutely life-changing. So who do you want to become? What sort of life do you want to have? Where will you be in 3 years? What will your health look like? Your fitness? Your relationship with family members? Your relationship with the Lord? Your happiness? I want to be in a better place in 3 years' time than where I am now. But that doesn't come through hope. We have hope. We have hope in the Lord. But he gives us the power to make choices. It comes from habits. It comes from these small choices done again and again and again to make a huge difference. You know, I'd like to take some time this morning to come before the Lord and just ask him, just say, Lord, what do you want me to change? And this is for me as well. There's not a single person on the planet that doesn't have bad habits. Definitely. So can we just take a moment to close our eyes and I'll pray. Lord, I thank you so much that you give us the power to change. Thank you so much that you give us a huge amount of control over our lives and how our lives are going to look. Lord, for each one of us in our hearts, can you tell me what is one habit you would like me to start? What is one habit you would like me to start? And now, Lord, can you tell me, what is one habit you would like me to stop? What is one habit you would like me to stop? Lord, I thank you that it is in your strength that we do these things. I thank you that when we rely on your strength, that you empower us. You give us the power to change. One small choice, done repeatedly, day after day after day, makes a huge difference. Amen.